Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
It's never too early to set expectations and goals for your child's education. The UA College Savings Plan provides opportunities that can help you reach your educational savings goals. Save in Alaska. Study anywhere. There is more information available by calling 1-888, the number 4, and then Alaska. This message sponsored by the UA College Savings Plan.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, I'm David Kramer here with your Alaska weather. As always, please visit our website, arh.noaa.gov, for any updates to the forecast. We also have a couple of warnings and advisories out today, so please check the website for additional information on any of those. Our weather info line is 1-800-472-0391. You can get updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can follow us on both Twitter and on Facebook. We will start off today with a quick look at those warnings and advisories. In the western part of the state, we have quite a few with some warnings. In the south, those are winter storm warnings there, and then we have some winter weather advisories further to the north. Those southern ones are primarily for some heavy snow and freezing rain, and that's going to start to transition over as we get further to the north. A little bit colder temperatures up there. Still going to see that heavier snow, but not a whole lot with the freezing rain. But we are going to see with some stronger winds, some blowing snow conditions that could really reduce visibility, so be careful out there. And a lot of these are going to be out until early hours tomorrow morning. As we look further to the east in the Alaska Range and near Delta Junction, we have some wind events happening, and those are primarily these wind advisories out to the west, and then the high wind warning further off to the east. We are expecting those to last until around 5 or 6 a.m. tomorrow morning as well. And if you're in any kind of channel terrain there or through any passes, those winds will be especially strong, so watch out. Again, you can check our website for additional information on any of these warnings or advisories. We'll click over now to our satellite imagery here. Having a little bit of a technical difficulty. Hold on for me for just a second. Trying to get that to slide on over. There we go. And if you notice out over the main part of the state, we have quite a bit of cloud cover due to some strong southerly flow, bringing in a lot of moisture from the south, expanding that out over much of the state. We'll watch this satellite loop once again as we look out over the southeastern part of the state. We have a trough moving in from the south, bringing in some rain just off the coastline in the eastern parts of the Gulf, starting to make their way towards the Alaska Panhandle there. Moving over to the western part of the state now, we'll take a look at it. You can kind of see before we get this in motion, quite a few little lows pretty weak, and as we watch this, you're going to start to see a lot of those start to fade away, but one a little bit more dominant to the south of Shimia, bringing some rain to areas further to the south of the Aleutian Islands right now. And as we watch one last time, notice to the south of the state, our next big system coming in from the south can start to see the cloud cover making its way closer to the eastern Aleutian Islands, and a lot of rain going to be associated with that strong southerly flow coming in from the North Pacific. As we take a look for the remainder of today, we have one of our lows out over the northern Bering, bringing in some snow showers around that. Not really a whole lot of impact out over the Aleutian Islands at this time, but as we move back over the southwestern part of the state, bringing in the southerly flow, some rain down there, but switching over pretty quickly to snow as we get further to the north and then up along the west coast of the state. Snow all the way up to around Barrow, and then further to the east, still some strong winds up there, bringing in some blowing snow conditions. Out over much of the interior part of the state, not a whole lot of activity with precipitation, but we are seeing quite a bit of cloud cover there. And then we are seeing some rain throughout much of the south central, extending through all of Kenai Peninsula. And then we are seeing that rain just off the coastline near the Panhandle. And as we look down at our next system coming up, you can start to see that frontal system bringing in some rain from the south. As we move into tonight, that front has moved into the Gulf of Alaska, bringing in rain to Kodiak Island now, a rain and snow mix to the Alaska Peninsula. And then as we get into the southwest, some isolated areas of snow shower out ahead of that system, but still the southerly flow out ahead of that front, bringing in a lot of rain throughout much of the Gulf Coast, extending down all the way down near Ketchikan. And as we move back towards the Alaska range, a little bit colder up there, switching to be a rain and snow mix. And then some isolated snow showers out over the eastern part of the state, becoming a little bit more dominant as we get closer to the Seward Peninsula. And then up along the coastline out to the western parts of the Arctic coast, we're going to see some snow and blowing snow conditions up there. And then down in the Bering Sea, we do have some isolated areas of snow showers remaining, but we have high pressure moving in, so these are diminished from what we were seeing during the day, and that's extending all the way into the eastern Aleutian Islands. Taking a look now at Wednesday, some isolated snow showers remaining for much of the Aleutian Islands, but the big story is the front that has now moved through much of southwest part of the state, extending down near the eastern Aleutian Islands. A rain-snow mix for much of that path, a little bit more rain as we get further along the Gulf Coast, and then a little bit more snow as we get closer to the YK Delta. Snow out ahead of that, extending up all the way along the west coast to around Barrow, again as we saw in the overnight hours. But now that snow is extending into the eastern Brooks Range. And as we get down towards the Alaska Range, we are going to see a rain-snow mix down there. So we get closer to the water, we are going to see that transition over to being rain, spreading all the way from Kodiak Island all the way along the northern Gulf Coast down into the Panhandle once again. And then as we look into Thursday, those stronger winds remaining, a lot of precip coming in with that moist flow from the south. Now that rain line pushing a little bit further to the north than it was throughout the day on Wednesday. A rain-snow mix in parts of the northern Copper River Basin and the eastern parts of the Alaska Range, becoming more isolated snow showers as we get into the interior, dropping off as we get into the Brooks Range and further to the north. As we look out over the southwest part of the state, again, that rain line is pushing up further into the YK Delta than it was before, now passing through the Bethel area there, but becoming a rain-snow mix as we get further to the north, and then around the Seward Peninsula becoming all snow once again. On the western side of this low, the northerly flow, though, is keeping snow all the way down in the Aleutian Islands and then way out to the west as well near Shimei, expecting snow out there throughout the day on Thursday. Taking a look now at our temperatures throughout the state. Starting in the south central, we are seeing temperatures in the mid-30s for the more interior locations, getting down to as low as 25 near Glen Allen. But along the Gulf Coast, we are seeing temperatures right around the lower to mid-40s there. And then as we move to the Alaska Panhandle, we are seeing colder temperatures further to the north, 38 degrees for Haines, 39 for Juneau. Warmer as we get further to the south, Ketchikan, 54 degrees as of 1 p.m. this afternoon. Taking us into the interior part of the state, temperatures remaining predominantly in the mid-20s. Warmer as we get further to the south at the park, seeing warmer temperatures there, 43 degrees this afternoon. But as we get further to the north near Arctic Village and through Anaktuvuk Pass, only 10 degrees there this afternoon. Up along the Arctic coast, staying right around those single digits. Some places out east a little bit colder. We are seeing Deadhorse only at -2. And that'll take us to the western part of the state. We're seeing temperatures down around 30 degrees, a little bit colder as we push off towards the west. Point Hope, 19 degrees there. Gamble down to 12 degrees this afternoon. And then down in the southwest part of the state, temperatures in the YK Delta area, lower to mid-30s there. Pretty similar as we move to the Bristol Bay area, with Dillingham down to 34 degrees this afternoon. And then in the mid-30s as we move along the Alaska Peninsula. And then out over the Aleutian Islands, we are seeing temperatures right around 30, with the coldest being furthest out to the west, 28 degrees at Shemya, 29 degrees for St. George. And then we'll switch over and look at some of our lows for tonight. Out over the Aleutian Islands into the mid-20s there. A little bit colder for St. Paul, down to 23 degrees for a low tonight. But as we get further to the east, temperatures dropping down in the eastern Aleutian Islands, down only to 30 degrees tonight. A little bit colder in the Bristol Bay area, mid-20s there, dropping to around 20 as we get into the YK Delta, 19 degrees for a low for Bethel tonight. And then as we move further to the north, a little bit colder as we get north of the Kotzebue Sound area, down into the teens, and then along the Arctic coast, dropping down below zero, -5 expected low tonight for Barrow, -9 for Deadhorse. Then down in the interior, going to see some in the single digits, some temperatures a little bit warmer, especially as we get further to the south. And as we make it into the south central, seeing temperatures into the mid-30s. Down in the Panhandle, we are seeing temperatures right around 40 degrees, colder to the north, 35 for Haines, warmer to the south, 45 for Ketchikan. Highs for tomorrow getting up into the mid-40s. Once again, colder to the north, warmer in the south, getting up to around 40 for much of the south central. And as we move into the interior, temperatures getting up into the mid-20s, a little bit colder for Fort Yukon, only getting up to 9 degrees there. And then along the Arctic coast, some places not making it back up to 0. Barrow going to stay below 0 at -1 for a high tomorrow. Down along the west coast of the state in the lower to mid-20s throughout much of the area, down into the Bristol Bay area where we finally get back up to around 40 degrees for a high tomorrow. King Salmon seeing 40 degrees for their high. And then in the Aleutian Islands getting right around freezing for highs tomorrow, with St. Paul a little bit colder, 31 degrees expected high there. Switching over now, we'll take a look at our aviation forecast. Some areas of MVFR conditions throughout much of the Bering Sea, those extending up to along the Arctic coast with some IFR out over the northwest. And then with our low coming up from the south, that front is going to bring in some MVFR switching over to IFR conditions along much of the Gulf Coast. And as the day progresses, these conditions will push further to the north. As we take a look at our passes, we can see Anaktuvuk will be VFR tomorrow, as will Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both be IFR throughout the day tomorrow. Rainy Pass should start off MVFR but then drop down to IFR, as will Windy Pass. Isabel Pass will do the same, starting off MVFR, dropping down to IFR. Mentasta will also be MVFR, dropping down to IFR. Tenedo should be IFR throughout the day, as will Portage. And Chilkoot and White will both be IFR for tomorrow. Now look at our freezing level. We have some warmer air along the eastern border of the state extending out into Canada, and another tongue of warm air coming in behind that next front that'll be moving in from the south. Our freezing line will kind of hug along the Gulf Coast, then extend out into Bristol Bay and out to the west over the Bering Sea down towards the western Aleutian Islands. Tomorrow's icing going to be a pretty widespread area extending from the eastern Aleutian Islands out through much of the south central, but that is going to be pretty high as well, above 10,000 feet there, with a lot of that warmer air moving in from the south. And then we have another area above 7,000 feet along the Arctic coastline. Our jet stream tomorrow pretty strong out of a westerly direction, up to as high as 200 knots, but that's going to be well south of the Aleutian Islands. However, with our low moving in from the south, 170 knot jet bringing that in towards the south central. We also have a branch of the jet at 75 knots coming in from the south and then moving out to more westerly direction over the northern part of the state, increasing to as high as 100 knots before it exits out over Canada. And then out over the Panhandle, we do have that 170 knot jet dropping down to about 105 as we see it over the Panhandle area. Taking us down to 9,000 feet, we have southeasterly flow with that frontal system moving up that is going to come all the way into the Gulf of Alaska, dropping down to around 40 knots over the main part of the state. But if we look out over to the west, that's going to stay pretty strong at 9,000 feet, 60 knots there. Becoming more westerly as it exits out into Canada, dropping down to around 35 knots there, but picking right back up out over northwestern Canada at 50 knots. Out over the Panhandle, 40 knots to 35 out of a southerly direction out over the eastern part of the state. And then as we look out over the Bering Sea, westerly flow around 30 knots, getting as high as 40 knots as it circulates around this low pressure system and then exits out to the west. Out over the eastern Aleutian Islands, an easterly flow, 40 knots dropping down to 30 as it gets over the eastern Aleutian Islands. As we take it down to 3,000 feet, pretty similar flow pattern. Low is developed in the lower level there, but we do have flow around 30 to 35 knots circulating around our low over the northern Bering, and we have flow coming in around our next low, getting up to as high as 40 knots over the eastern Aleutian Islands. But our main problem is still out in the east. Moving into the Gulf, we have flow 50 to 55 knots, picking up right along the coastline, getting up to as high as 60 knots there. Moving into the interior part of the state, dropping down pretty quickly down to around 30 and then exiting off to the east once again. Over the Panhandle, we do have flow 50 knots coming in, so expecting to see a little bit of turbulence with that as well. And we can see that as we look at our turbulence chart below 6,000 feet out over the Panhandle, becoming more moderate as we move out over the south central, extending into the Bristol Bay area. Below 6,000 feet there, we do have some isolated areas of severe expected, and that extends out into the eastern Aleutian Islands with the moderate conditions, not the severe conditions. Those will be more associated with Kamishak Bay and the Kenai Peninsula. And then up along the western part of the Seward Peninsula below 4,000 feet, some moderate turbulence there. And then along the Arctic coast below 4,000 feet, expecting some turbulence there as well. If you stay with us, we'll be back shortly with the marine forecast.
Okay, we're all set. Oil's okay, gas is sumped, hydraulic reservoir is full. Now that your pre-flight's complete, it's a good idea to go and get a weather briefing from your local flight service station. In this country, it's real important. How's it going, Dick?
Pretty good, Don. How you doing this morning?
Yeah, good. Heading up to the hill today, southeast Fort. What do you got for weather up in that area?
Well, basically, we've got a pretty well entrenched high-pressure system over Siberia. It's keeping the lows pretty well south of us along the chain in the peninsula. We'll probably be in the fringe area up here of some middle and high clouds, 12,000 scattered with high thin cirrus. Lower clouds and possibly some light precipitation in the southern Susitna Valley, but I don't expect any up in the northern valley or along the range today.
Okay. All right, real good. Thanks, Dick. And we'll file flight plan. Because of some of the extreme weather conditions up on the glacier and the environment there, we want to be sure and bring some special survival gear along. For sure, a couple of sleeping bags, an extra parka, some snowshoes, some good survival gear. Your life could depend on it. Okay, a good talk is a word sadal. And that includes C for controls, that controls move free and easy. I for instruments. I've got that's your directional gyro set, altimeter set. Gauges are in the green. Valve flap open. G, gas. A, attitude. R, rudder set. Rudder set. Diesels on board the aircraft. And 4 hours of fuel on board. 2 hours in route southeast for the glacier. Survival gear on board. 2 hours in route past on file on fuel. As we start gaining altitude, we'll slowly start losing our manifold pressure because of the density of the air. So as we climb, I'll slowly be creeping into the throttle on that. real good. We still don't have visual. We'll enter one side pass at about a 45-degree angle, and we're watching the wind, you know, come over the top of it. Okay, so we have insight down.
Welcome back. We'll start off with a look at the ice edge. We do still have some ice in the upper parts of the Cook Inlet north of Callaghan Island, and then as we look out to the west, we have a few areas in the Bristol Bay area, but not until Cape Newingham do we have the main part of the ice edge extending off into the northern Bering Sea, and that's going to be to the south of Nunavik Island. Taking a look out over the southeast part of the state, switching to our main marine forecast. Primary flow out of a southeasterly direction up to as high as 35 knots out in the Gulf, dropping down to 15 knots and changing to be northeasterly as we get closer towards Yakutat. Inside waters out of a southerly southeasterly direction, 15 to 30 knots, strongest in the south. Seas there 3 to 9 feet, again highest in the south. And then as we get out over the Gulf, 13 to 15 feet for seas, and then around 8 for the seas near Yakutat. That's all on Wednesday. And then on Thursday, similar flow out of the southeast, 25 to 35 knots, strongest as we get further to the north. Inside waters, still out of a south or easterly direction, up to as high as 25 knots there. Seas getting up to as high as 18 feet out in parts of the eastern Gulf. Taking us out towards the south central, flow out of an easterly direction, becoming northeasterly as we get further off towards the western part of this area, down in the Cook Inlet, extending down into Shelikof Strait areas there. 25 knots up in the north, up to as high as 35 knots in many of the places around Kodiak Island. The strongest are the barrier jet along right south of Kodiak, or Cordova, and that's going to be out of the east at 50 knots there. Seas highest there as well, 20 feet, down into the single digits as we get closer to the west. As we switch it up towards Thursday, flow now out of a more southeasterly direction until we get into Cook Inlet out of a northeasterly direction, 10 to 15 knots there. Strongest out in the Gulf, up to as high as 30 knots, with seas getting up to as high as 18 feet south of Kodiak. As we look out over the Alaska Peninsula, flow out of primarily a northeasterly direction, all around 35 knots. Strongest seas on the Pacific side up to 15 feet there, down to as low as 9 feet in the Bristol Bay area. And then on Thursday, flow becoming more southeasterly, 35 knots, becoming easterly as we get into the Bering side. And then seas strongest once again on the Pacific side, 19 to 20 feet there, dropping down to around 9 feet on the Bering side. Out over the Aleutian Islands, flow out of the north, getting as high as 40 knots, weaker as we get further off to the west. Seas strongest on the Pacific side, 14 to 16 feet there, weaker as we get further to the west, dropping down to around 7 feet. Freezing spray out to the west with the colder temperatures out there. And then on Thursday, flow becoming more northwesterly, up to as high as 35 knots, once again dropping down as we get further off to the west and switching to be southerly as we get closer to Shemya. Along the west coast of the state, pretty variable flow in the northern parts out of a southerly direction, 15 to 20 knots there. But as we drop down closer to the Pribilofs, out of a more northerly direction, 25 to 35 knots, strongest out to the east, and some freezing spray associated with those stronger winds out east as well. Then we have our seas getting up to as high as 8 feet and then becoming ice covered as we get closer towards St. Lawrence Island. Then on Thursday, flow out of a northerly direction, starting off around 15 knots, getting up to as high as 35 knots as we get further off to the south, and then out closer to Cape Newingham, flow becoming more easterly at that 35 knots, seas up to as high as 12 feet. Up along the Arctic coast, A main part of the flow out of a northeasterly direction, 15 to 25 knots there. Way out in the east, we have westerly flow around 10 knots on Wednesday. Then on Thursday, flow primarily be coming out of the east up to around 25 to 30 knots there, switching up a little bit as we get closer to the Bering Strait, dropping down to 15 knots out of a northeasterly direction. Quick recap out over the weather for tonight. Isolated areas of snow showers up to the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, becoming more rain as we get into the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island area, with the next frontal system coming up from the south. A lot of stronger winds associated with that as well. Snow all the way along the west coast with blowing snow conditions included up near Barrow, and then as we move to the eastern parts of the interior, isolated snow showers there. Switching over to rain along the Gulf Coast, extending into the Panhandle. We do have that continuing into much of Wednesday with that strong southerly flow bringing rain and eventually snow to much of Alaska, going a little bit more isolated as we get further to the north. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer, and thanks for being with us tonight.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
It's never too early to set expectations and goals for your child's education. The UA College Savings Plan provides opportunities that can help you reach your educational savings goals. Save in Alaska. Study anywhere. There is more information available by calling 1-888, the number 4, and then Alaska. This message sponsored by the UA College Savings Plan.